Margaret Wilson had survived things that would have broken most people. She survived poverty. She survived widowhood. She survived raising 6 children alone in a country that never slows down for struggling mothers. For 40 years, she woke up before sunrise and went asleep after exhaustion stopped hurting. She worked. She cooked. She cleaned. She endured. And she never once asked her children to remember what she gave up. She believed love was enough. Her husband died suddenly, leaving her with a small house, unpaid bills, and 6 children who still believed their mother could fix anything. Margaret didn't argue with fate. She negotiated with it. She took night shifts cleaning office buildings, morning shifts at a local diner. She stitched clothes late into the night so her children could wear something new at school. When food ran low, she smiled and said she wasn't hungry. When sickness came, she ignored it, because mothers learn early that pain is optional. Her children grew up hearing one sentence over and over again: "We'll manage." And somehow they always did. 4 sons, 2 daughters: David, Michael, Robert, Andrew, Sarah, Emily, each one educated, each one successful, each one proud. By the time Margaret turned 70, the house she had protected for decades was finally paid off. It was quiet now, too quiet. The kind of quiet that reminds you how much life has passed. Margaret filled her days with volunteering, food banks, community centers, elderly women who had no one left to listen. That's where the idea formed, not out of sadness. Out of gratitude, she wanted to give back half of her property, half of the house she had fought to keep, to charity, to single mothers, to abandoned elders, to people who reminded her of herself. She didn't think it would be controversial. She didn't think it would be dangerous. At Sunday dinner, she mentioned it gently. "I'm thinking of donating part of the house," she said, "to charity after I'm gone." The reaction wasn't anger, it was silence, the wrong kind. Forks stopped moving, eyes shifted. Calculations happened behind polite smiles. David was the first to speak. "That's generous, Mom," Michael nodded slowly, "very thoughtful." Sarah squeezed Margaret's hand, but her grip was tight. Possessive, Margaret felt it. That night she didn't sleep well. Her instincts, honed by decades of survival, kept whispering. Something had changed. The phone calls started the next morning, not to ask how she felt, to ask questions. "Have you spoken to a lawyer? Is the paperwork finalized? Who controls the trust?" Questions arrived faster than concern ever had. Within days, her children began visiting more often. Suddenly, they had time. They brought groceries she didn't need, fixed things that weren't broken, sat too close, listened too carefully. Margaret noticed how conversations shifted, from memories to ownership, from love to control. One afternoon, she overheard Michael whispering to David. "She's confused," he said. "At her age, that happens." Confused, Margaret stood still behind the hallway wall. Her heart didn't race, it sank. Because confusion is a word people use when they want power without guilt. That night, Margaret visited her lawyer quietly. She updated her will, strengthened legal protections, registered the charity trust officially. She told no one. Because something inside her understood this truth: the moment money becomes involved, family becomes a negotiation. The pressure increased. "You've done enough, Mom," Andrew said. "Let us handle things." "At 70, decisions get complicated," Emily added gently. Complicated, Margaret smiled politely, but inside something cracked. These were the children she had fed while starving. The children she had defended when the world was cruel, and now they were positioning her like an obstacle. One night she woke up to voices. Low, urgent, inside her house. Her heart pounded. She stayed still, listening. David's voice. "She won't sign willingly," Michael answered without hesitation. "Then we don't give her a choice." Margaret's hands trembled. This wasn't family disagreement. This was intent. She locked her bedroom door for the first time in 70 years. If you're still listening, subscribe. Stories like this exist because greed doesn't announce itself, it whispers first. Margaret sat on her bed until morning, not afraid of dying, afraid of being erased. Afraid that the people she raised knew exactly how to break her without leaving marks. She understood something painful that night. Love does not protect you from greed. And sometimes, the people you give everything to become the ones who want everything you have. This was only the beginning. And Margaret Wilson was about to discover that surviving the world was easy compared to surviving her own children. Margaret Wilson stopped telling herself she was imagining things. The looks, The tone, the sudden concern that felt less like love and more like inspection. Her children were no longer visiting to see her. They were coming to assess her. Every visit followed the same pattern. They checked the kitchen first, then the bills, then her medication, then her memory. Did you already pay this, Mom? Do you remember what the lawyer said? Are you sure you didn't misunderstand? They said it softly, smiling like caretakers, but Margaret noticed what they didn't hide well. They never asked how she felt. They only asked what she remembered. David started showing up unannounced. He'd sit at the table with his laptop open, reviewing documents that weren't his. Just making sure everything's organized, he said. Michael followed with suggestions. You should put one of us on the house deed, he said casually. It'll make things easier if something happens. Something happens. That phrase followed her around the house like a shadow. Sarah began calling daily, not to talk, to check. What did the lawyer say today? Did you sign anything? Who else knows about this charity idea? Emily played the role of comfort. She made tea, sat close, spoke slowly, as if Margaret needed help understanding simple sentences. At 70, Mom, stress can affect judgment, Emily said gently. Margaret smiled, but her hands shook under the table. Because she understood something now, they weren't worried about her health. They were worried about her decisions. One afternoon, Robert arrived with papers. He didn't explain them. He placed them in front of her. Just sign these, he said. They're temporary? Margaret adjusted her glasses and read every line. Power of attorney, medical authority, financial control, temporary. She looked up. I'm not signing this, she said calmly. Robert's smile vanished. You don't understand, he snapped. This is for your own good. Margaret stood up. I understand perfectly, she said, and I said no. That word changed everything. No, it landed hard. That evening the tone shifted. Phone calls stopped sounding polite. Messages became urgent. Voices hardened. You're being stubborn. You're embarrassing us. People are talking about what? Her choice to help others, her choice to control her own life. Margaret stopped answering the phone. She spent more time in her room. She kept her door locked at night. She hid important documents in places no one would think to look, because survival teaches you to prepare quietly. Then came the first real threat. Not shouted, not written, whispered. Andrew leaned close one evening and said, if you don't cooperate, we'll have to make decisions without you. Margaret looked at him. About my life, she asked. About your future, he corrected. That night she found her bedroom window unlocked. She never left it open. Her heart pounded. She checked the living room, drawers disturbed, papers moved, not taken, just examined. A message without words, we can reach you. Margaret didn't sleep. She sat with the light on until morning. Fear settled into her bones, not the fear of death, the fear of being declared incapable. Because once that happens, everything you own stops being yours. If you're still listening, subscribe. Some stories are terrifying because they happen quietly inside families behind closed doors. Margaret went back to her lawyer the next day. She didn't cry, she didn't dramatize, she spoke in facts. My children are pressuring me, they want control. I feel unsafe in my own home. The lawyer listened carefully. He arranged protections, witnesses, documentation. Emergency contacts, he warned her gently. Family disputes over property can escalate fast, he said. Margaret nodded. She already knew. That weekend, all 6 children came together, unannounced. They sat in the living room like a meeting had been scheduled. David spoke first. We're worried about you. Margaret noticed how everyone avoided her eyes. Michael continued. You're making choices that affect all of us. Affect all of us. Robert leaned forward. The house belongs to the family. Margaret felt something inside her finally break. No, she said quietly. The house belongs to me. Silence, then anger. You wouldn't have it without us, Sarah said. Margaret stared at her. I had it before you could walk, she replied. Emily stood up. This isn't about gratitude, she said. It's about fairness. Fairness, Margaret laughed, a soft, tired sound. I gave you my life, she said. What part of that felt unfair? The room exploded, voices overlapping, accusations flying. You're selfish. You're confused. You're destroying this family. Margaret backed away, her heart raced. She realized then how quickly love turns violent when money enters the conversation. David stepped closer, lowered his voice. If you don't sign, he said, we'll make sure you don't have a choice. Margaret locked herself in her bedroom that night. She called a friend, then another. She left the house before sunrise and stayed elsewhere, because home no longer felt safe. That was the moment she accepted the truth she had avoided. Her children weren't asking anymore, they were planning. And plans don't require consent, they require opportunity. Margaret looked at the house one last time before leaving, the walls she had protected, the rooms she had filled with sacrifice, and she understood the cruelest lesson of all. Raising children teaches them everything, including how to take from you. This wasn't about inheritance anymore, it was about control. And the next move wouldn't be polite, it would be decisive. If you're still with this story, subscribe. What comes next is the moment greed stops pretending to be concerned. Because Margaret Wilson was about to face something far more dangerous than poverty. She was about to face her own children when patience runs out. And when that happens, love doesn't stop them, only consequences do. Margaret learned something cruel very quickly. Once fear enters a family, it doesn't announce itself. It rearranges furniture, it changes routines, it turns familiar voices into threats. She stayed away from the house for 2 nights. At a friend's place, sleeping on a couch that smelled like someone else's life. She told herself it was temporary, that things would cool down. They didn't. Her phone filled with messages, not apologies, instructions. Come home so we can talk. You're making this worse. Don't force us to involve doctors. Doctors, that word landed hard because doctors don't come to help, they come to certify. Margaret returned home in daylight, hoping the sun would make everyone reasonable. The house felt different. Too quiet, too organized. Family photos had been moved, drawers rearranged. Her desk opened. She checked her lockbox. It was still there, but someone had tried to open it. David arrived an hour later. Alone, calm, he sat across from her like a negotiator. Mom, he said, we don't want this to get ugly. Margaret looked at her son. The boy she once carried on her hip while cleaning offices at night. I don't want anything ugly either, she said. I want peace. David sighed. Peace comes from cooperation. He slid a folder across the table, new papers. Different wording, more final, guardianship, immediate authority. Margaret didn't touch them. I'm not signing, she said. David leaned back, his voice dropped. Then you're leaving us no choice? What choice? She asked. David smiled. The responsible one? That night, Margaret locked herself in her bedroom again. She kept her phone charged, her bag packed, her documents hidden. Sleep came in pieces. Just before dawn, she heard the door open. Footsteps, whispers. Her heart slammed against her ribs, the handle turned. Slowly, Margaret held her breath. The door didn't open, instead something heavy pressed against it. Testing, then laughter, soft, satisfied. The message was clear, we can get in when we want. Margaret called her lawyer at sunrise. He told her something she didn't want to hear. Property disputes inside families escalate quickly, he said. You need witnesses, you need to document everything. Document everything. Margaret began writing. Times, words, who said what, who threatened what, because stories without records disappear. That afternoon, all 6 children came again, together. No warning, they stood in the living room like a tribunal. David spoke first. We've talked, he said. Michael continued. You're not capable of managing assets responsibly, Robert added. We're doing this for your protection. Margaret's chest tightened. This is my house, she said. My life, Andrew stepped forward. And that's the problem, he said. You think it's still yours. The room felt smaller. Sarah blocked the doorway without realizing it. Emily stood near the phone. Margaret noticed everything. Because survival sharpens attention, she stood up. I'm asking you to leave, she said. No one moved. David stepped closer, lowered his voice. You're not leaving this house unless you sign. Margaret felt the first shove before she realized it was happening. Not hard enough to remind her of gravity, enough to say we're serious now. She stumbled back. Her elbow hit the wall. Pain flared. The room went silent. Then excuses rushed in. It was an accident. She lost balance. See. She's not steady. Margaret understood something terrifying. They weren't panicking. They were rehearsed. She grabbed her phone. David knocked it from her hand. It slid across the floor. Michael picked it up. We're trying to help, he said calmly. That was when Margaret screamed, not in fear, in clarity. Her scream broke the room. A neighbor knocked, hard. Everything okay in there? The children froze. Margaret shouted again. I need help. The neighbor didn't wait for permission. He opened the door. The moment shattered. The children stepped back. Masks returned. Smiles appeared. Margaret bent down and picked up her phone with shaking hands. She left the house that afternoon with the neighbor, didn't pack, didn't explain. She went straight to the police. This time she brought notes, dates, witnesses, photos of her bruised arm. The officer listened, not dismissively, not kindly, carefully, because now there was a record, an incident, a third party. That night Margaret didn't go home. She went somewhere safe, and for the first time in weeks she cried, not for the house, not for the money, for the truth she could no longer deny. Her children weren't arguing with her. They were preparing to remove her. Legally, physically, quietly. If you're still listening, subscribe. Some stories turn dark the moment witnesses appear because secrecy is the only thing greed needs. The next morning, Margaret received a text from David. "We didn't mean for it to go that far." She stared at the words. There was no apology, only damage control. She replied with one sentence. "I'm done negotiating?" That sentence would change everything. Because when abusers lose access, they escalate. And Margaret Wilson had just crossed the line between inconvenience and obstacle. What came next wouldn't be whispered. It would be planned, and it would involve the one thing she loved more than property, her freedom. Margaret didn't expect the next attack to come through paperwork. Violence had failed, fear had failed, so they changed tactics. Within 48 hours, her lawyer called her early in the morning. His voice was careful, measured. "Margaret," he said, "your children have filed an emergency petition." She closed her eyes. "For what?" she asked. "Guardianship," he replied. "They're claiming you're mentally unfit to manage your assets." Unfit. The word felt heavier than any shove. They weren't trying to scare her anymore. They were trying to erase her authority. By noon, the papers arrived. 6 signatures, 6 statements, each one written in clean, polite language. Concerned children, declining memory, poor judgment, risky financial decisions, charity. They framed charity like evidence of confusion. Margaret read every page slowly, not because she didn't understand. Because she couldn't believe how calmly betrayal could be typed. She didn't cry, she felt something colder. Resolve. Her lawyer explained the process: court-ordered evaluation, temporary control, asset freeze. "If they succeed," he said gently, "you lose decision-making power immediately." Margaret nodded. She had survived worse, but this was different. This attack wore her children's handwriting. If you're still listening, subscribe. Some stories are terrifying because they show how abuse can wear a legal suit. The children didn't call. They let the documents speak, but Margaret could hear them anyway. She imagined the meetings, the rehearsed concern, the agreement to lie for a shared reward. She prepared. She gathered medical records, doctor letters, bank statements, volunteer references. People who knew her mind was sharp, her intentions clear. The evaluation day arrived quietly. A small office, a polite psychiatrist, standard questions, dates, names, current events. Margaret answered calmly. Then the doctor asked the question that mattered. "Why do you want to donate half your property to charity?" Margaret didn't hesitate. "Because I don't want my life reduced to inheritance," she said. "I want it reduced to impact." The doctor looked up. Something shifted. The hearing came next. Her children sat in a line across from her, all 6, well-dressed, confident. David spoke like a spokesperson. "We're only trying to protect our mother," he said. Michael added, "She's vulnerable." Sarah wiped fake tears. Emily nodded sympathetically. Margaret watched them. The same children who once fought over cereal, now united by greed. Margaret stood when it was her turn. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't plead. She told the truth. "I raised 6 children alone," she said. "I worked until my hands cracked. I fed them when I was hungry. I am not confused, I am generous." The judge listened. Carefully, witnesses spoke, neighbors, volunteers, the lawyer. The psychiatrist submitted his report, competent, clear-minded, decisive. The ruling came quickly. Petition denied. No guardianship, no asset control. Margaret won. But victories like this come with consequences. Outside the courthouse, David didn't look at her. Michael muttered something under his breath. Robert stared with open anger. Emily smiled thinly. That smile said everything. This wasn't over, it had just moved. That night, Margaret returned to the house with a police escort, temporary, procedural. The house felt violated, drawers opened, files missing, locks tampered with. Her lawyer confirmed it the next morning. An attempt had been made to file a forged deed transfer. Sloppy, desperate, criminal, Margaret filed another report. Another record, another line of defense. Her children were no longer pretending this was about concern. They were racing time, because charity deadlines were approaching, and they knew something she didn't yet. The property had value beyond money. It held leverage. Margaret began sleeping lightly, listening to every sound. She installed cameras, upgraded locks. She told trusted neighbors everything, because secrecy had almost destroyed her. Transparency would protect her. If you're still with this story, subscribe. What comes next is the moment when patience runs out and desperation takes over. One evening, her phone rang, unknown number. She answered, David's voice. Low, controlled. You embarrassed us, he said. You took something that should have stayed in the family. Margaret breathed slowly. I gave you my life, she replied. That wasn't enough for you. There was silence. Then David spoke again. Sign the papers, he said. Or this gets messy. Margaret hung up. She sat alone in the kitchen for a long time, then she did something she hadn't done before. She stopped reacting. She started planning. Because when people try to steal your future, the only answer is to secure it publicly. And Margaret Wilson was about to make a decision that would end every private threat by bringing everything into the light. Margaret Wilson stopped hiding. She stopped whispering. And the moment she did, everything changed. The first call she made wasn't to the police, it was to a journalist, not a television personality, not a gossip writer. Someone who handled slow stories, legal stories, stories that survive scrutiny. The journalist listened quietly as Margaret spoke. No interruptions, no shock, just questions that mattered, dates, documents, names, patterns. Margaret had those, she had notes, reports, court filings, threatening messages saved carefully, security footage of late-night visits. The journalist exhaled slowly. This isn't a family dispute, she said. This is elder abuse. That word carried weight. Elder abuse. It reframed everything. The story didn't publish immediately. It was verified, cross-checked, confirmed, because truth moves slowly when it plans to stay. When the article finally appeared, it didn't accuse, it documented. A 70-year-old widow, 6 adult children, a legal attempt to seize property, a failed guardianship petition. A charity trust targeted as evidence of confusion. The response was immediate, not loud, heavy. Community leaders shared it. Legal advocates discussed it. Neighbors recognized the house. Margaret's phone rang nonstop. Support, outrage. Questions, her children went silent. For the first time, no calls came from them. No instructions, no threats, because silence had turned dangerous. If you're still listening, subscribe. Some stories only work when daylight reaches them. The next move came from a different direction. A letter arrived from a state agency. An inquiry, routine, they said, but it wasn't routine. It meant oversight, it meant records, it meant consequences. Margaret welcomed it. She handed over everything. When people have nothing to hide, transparency feels like relief. Her children began reacting, not apologizing, managing damage. David emailed a carefully worded statement to relatives. We're concerned about mom's mental health, he wrote. Media pressure can confuse elderly people. Michael contacted the journalist, accusing her of exploitation. Sarah posted vague messages about betrayal on social media. Emily blocked Margaret entirely, but the evidence didn't care about narratives. The agency investigation uncovered something worse. The forged deed attempt, the pressure campaign, the coordinated statements. Suddenly, this wasn't about charity. It was about conspiracy. A formal notice was issued. The children were warned. Any further attempts to control assets would trigger criminal review. Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in months. Safety, temporary, fragile, but real. One evening, she received a message from Robert. Not angry, afraid. This has gone too far, he wrote. Can we talk? Margaret didn't reply because abusers talk when exposure hurts. The charity trust went public the next week. A press release, a mission statement, a deadline. The property donation was now scheduled. Locked, irreversible. The children panicked. David called repeatedly, left messages that sounded rehearsed. We can fix this. Let's keep it private. You don't want to be remembered like this. Remembered like this. Margaret smiled sadly. She didn't want to be remembered as silent. If you're still here, subscribe. This is the point where greed realizes it miscalculated. The agency moved faster. Interviews were conducted. Statements recorded. The neighbor who intervened came forward. The lawyer submitted timelines. The psychiatrist's report resurfaced. Clear-minded, competent, intentional, the children's story began to collapse not emotionally, legally. A civil case was opened. Restraining orders were discussed. The threat of criminal charges hung quietly in the air. Margaret didn't celebrate, she organized. She updated her will again, added public witnesses, created safeguards that would survive her. One night the phone rang, unknown number, she answered. David's voice trembled. "You've destroyed this family," he said. Margaret paused. "No," she replied, "I revealed it." She hung up. That night she slept without locking her door for the first time in months. But peace doesn't last when desperation grows. And desperation makes people reckless. The children hadn't lost yet. They were about to try one final move, one that wouldn't involve paperwork, one that would test how far Margaret was willing to go, and how visible she was willing to make the truth. If you're still listening, subscribe. The next part is where control breaks completely and consequences finally arrive. Because when exposure fails, greed doesn't retreat, it escalates. The final attempt didn't come with papers, it came with pressure. The kind that doesn't knock, it waits. Margaret noticed it first in the silence. No calls, no messages, no threats. That silence felt heavier than anything before. Because silence means planning. She didn't stay alone anymore. Neighbors rotated visits. A volunteer from the charity checked in daily. Cameras stayed on. Lights stayed on. Margaret learned how to live in visibility. Because predators avoid witnesses. The first sign arrived on a Tuesday evening. A car she didn't recognize idled across the street, engine running, lights off. It stayed for 30 minutes. Left, returned the next night. Margaret didn't panic. She documented time, plate, angle. She sent it to her lawyer. And the journalist. Transparency had become muscle memory. If you're still listening, subscribe. This is the moment where intimidation tries to replace persuasion. The next move came through a voicemail. David's voice, careful, soft. "Mom," he said, "this is getting dangerous for everyone." Dangerous for everyone, not for her, for them. He continued, "There are people asking questions, agencies. Donors, you don't want strangers tearing us apart?" Us. Margaret listened until the end, then forwarded it. Every word mattered now. 2 days later, the state agency escalated. A formal notice, cease and desist. Any contact outside counsel would be considered harassment. The children responded the only way people do when doors close. They tried to go around them. Andrew showed up at the charity's office, demanded meetings. Accused staff of manipulation. Security escorted him out. The incident was recorded, witnessed, filed. Robert tried a different angle. He contacted an old family friend. Asked her to convince Margaret to slow things down. The friend refused, called Margaret instead. That refusal mattered, because control collapses when allies stop cooperating. Emily resurfaced, not with threats, with tears. She left a message late at night. "I don't recognize us anymore," she said. "Please end this." Margaret didn't respond, because endings don't come from requests that arrive only when leverage disappears. The car returned one last time. Parked closer. The driver stayed inside. Margaret called the non-emergency line. An officer arrived, spoke to the driver. The car left. It didn't come back. If you're still with this story, subscribe. Fear loses power the moment it meets documentation. The legal consequences began quietly. A civil filing, restraining orders issued, not dramatic, effective, contact prohibited, distance enforced. Violation penalties explained clearly. For the first time, boundaries weren't suggestions. They were consequences. The children's lawyers requested mediation. Margaret declined because mediation assumes equal ground. This wasn't equal. This was coercion. The agency concluded its review. Findings were released: coordinated pressure, attempted undue influence. Elder abuse indicators confirmed. The language was clinical, the impact wasn't. Community response intensified, donations increased. Volunteers shared Margaret's story at trainings, not names, patterns that mattered more. Margaret recorded a short statement. No accusations, no anger, just facts. "I wanted my life to help others," she said. "I didn't know that choice would put me at risk." The clip circulated quietly. It reached people who needed it, and it reached people who feared it. The children retreated, not reconciled. Contained, they stopped calling, stopped appearing, stopped testing limits. Silence returned, but this time it felt earned. Margaret slept better not because she felt invincible, because she felt supported. She met with her lawyer one final time that month. Updated protections, public trustees, successor oversight. No single person could undo her choices again. If you're still listening, subscribe. The next part is where consequences become permanent and the lesson becomes unavoidable. Margaret understood something now. Safety isn't the absence of threat, it's the presence of systems that respond. The final chapter wasn't about punishment. It was about prevention, and that meant one more step, a step that would outlast her, because legacy isn't what you leave behind, it's what you make impossible to steal. The courtroom didn't feel hostile, it felt disappointed. Margaret noticed that immediately. The judge didn't look angry, he looked tired of seeing families destroy themselves over money they didn't earn. The case wasn't criminal. Not yet, it was civil, restraining orders, asset protection, findings of elder abuse. But civil court has a way of saying something clearly without shouting. Margaret sat quietly behind her lawyer. She didn't look at her children. She didn't need to, she already knew their faces better than anyone in that room. David spoke first, his voice was controlled, respectful, he framed everything as misunderstanding, stress, concern, family conflict. Michael followed. Talking about fear, about protecting legacy, about preventing strangers from stealing family property. Margaret listened, not with anger, with clarity. This was the same language they had used at her kitchen table. Only now it echoed in a room where words were recorded. When it was Margaret's turn, she stood slowly. She didn't cry, she didn't accuse. She told her story like a timeline, 40 years of work, widowhood, raising 6 children alone. Her decision to donate, the pressure, the threats, the shove, the forged paperwork, the attempts to declare her unfit. She looked at the judge. "I didn't lose my memory," she said. "I lost my illusion." The room was silent. The judge reviewed documents, messages, security footage, agency findings. The decision came without delay. Permanent restraining orders, no contact without legal counsel, no authority over assets, no role in estate decisions. The ruling wasn't dramatic, it was devastating, because it removed access. If you're still listening, subscribe. Some endings aren't loud, they're final. Outside the courtroom, reporters waited. Margaret declined interviews. She didn't want spectacle, she wanted closure. Her children exited separately. David avoided cameras. Michael looked furious. Robert looked lost. Andrew looked ashamed. Sarah cried. Emily didn't appear at all. Consequences don't always look the same, but they arrive, quietly, relentlessly. The charity trust was finalized that same week. Half the property transferred, publicly, irreversibly. The remaining half placed under independent oversight. No single heir, no shortcuts. Margaret's lawyer explained it simply. "No one can undo this." Margaret nodded. She felt lighter, not happy, free. Freedom feels calm, not joyful. Community support grew, workshops, panels. Quiet conversations in rooms full of people who recognized themselves in her story. Margaret attended one. She sat in the back. She listened. She realized something painful and powerful. Her story wasn't rare. It was just rarely spoken out loud. Her children tried one last approach. Through lawyers, an apology letter, carefully written, no admission, just regret for how things were handled. Margaret read it once, then filed it away. Apologies without accountability don't heal. They manage optics. She didn't respond. Because silence this time was a boundary, the restraining orders held. Months passed. No calls, no visits, no pressure. Margaret learned how to live with distance. It wasn't peace, it was safety. She returned to volunteering. This time she spoke openly, about warning signs, about financial abuse, about how love doesn't excuse control. If you're still here, subscribe. Stories like this matter because they give language to experiences people struggle to name. One evening, Margaret sat alone in the house. The same house, but it felt different now, not like a battleground. Like a statement, she walked through each room slowly, remembering, letting go. She stopped in the living room, where the first dinner conversation had changed everything. She smiled sadly. This was never about property, she said softly to herself. It was about permission, and she had finally taken hers back. There was only one part left, not about court, not about children, about meaning. About what survives after betrayal. in how a woman at 70 taught an entire system how to listen. Margaret Wilson woke up on her 71st birthday without fear for the first time in a year. No pounding heart, no listening for footsteps, no checking locks twice. The house was quiet in a way that felt earned. She made coffee and sat by the window, watching morning light touch the walls she had protected for decades. This house had seen everything: hunger, laughter, loss, and the moment love turned conditional, she didn't feel bitterness. She felt clarity. Distance had given her something she hadn't expected: perspective. She understood now that raising children doesn't guarantee gratitude, it guarantees capability, and capability without values becomes entitlement. Margaret spent the morning answering letters. Handwritten ones, from caregivers, from volunteers, from people who had recognized their own families in her story. One line appeared again and again. "I didn't know this had a name." Elder abuse. Financial coercion, undue influence. Language gave people permission to see what had always been happening. If you're still listening, subscribe. Stories like this don't end with justice alone, they begin conversations that save others. The charity held a small gathering that afternoon. No cameras, no speeches, just people who would benefit from what Margaret had chosen to protect. Single mothers, older women, families rebuilding quietly. Margaret didn't stand at the center, she sat among them, listening, because listening had finally become mutual. A young woman approached her afterward. "My family says I'm selfish," she said softly. "For wanting control over my own life." Margaret smiled gently. "Selfish is taking," she replied, "not choosing." That sentence felt like closure. Months passed, the legal dust settled, the restraining orders remained. The oversight stayed in place. The house became a space of purpose rather than tension. Margaret returned to routines she had abandoned: morning walks, volunteering, cooking meals that tasted like effort, not fear. Her children did not return. And that absence hurt in quiet waves, but pain without danger is survivable. One evening, Margaret received a final letter, no return address. Inside was a single sentence: "We didn't recognize you when you stopped needing us." Margaret folded the paper carefully. She didn't respond, because recognition should never be a condition of love. If you're still here, subscribe. The last lesson matters most. Margaret updated her personal journal that night, not with anger, with truth. "I raised my children to stand," she wrote. "I forgot to teach them how to stop taking." She didn't regret generosity, she regretted silence. The charity announced its first funded programs the following spring: housing support, legal clinics, education grants. Margaret attended quietly. She watched others receive what she had once needed, and she felt something like peace. Not because everything was forgiven, but because everything was accounted for. On a warm afternoon, Margaret walked through the house one last time with a notary and witnesses. Everything documented, everything protected, everything transparent. She placed a small plaque by the front door. It didn't have her name, it had a sentence: "This home exists because someone chose people over possession." If you're still listening, subscribe. Some endings stay with you because they offer a way forward. Margaret Wilson didn't win because she was strong. She won because she refused to be quiet, because she learned that boundaries are not punishments, they are protections. Her story didn't go viral because it was dramatic. It mattered because it was familiar, because greed often wears a family face, and because courage sometimes looks like paperwork, witnesses, and the decision to tell the truth out loud. The lesson is simple. If someone pressures you to give up control, ask who benefits. If concern arrives only when money is involved, question it. And if love demands silence, it isn't love. Margaret turned off the lights that night and went to sleep peacefully. Not because her life was perfect, but because it was finally hers. And that is the one thing no one should ever have to earn back. This story ends here, but its warning shouldn't. Listen early, document always. And remember, you don't owe anyone your future, not even the people you raised. If this story meant something to you, subscribe for more untold true stories. Because sometimes the most powerful legacy isn't what you leave your family, it's what you refuse to let them take.